You're just in time. You are recognized for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses who are here today. I appreciate you all and your time. First, to start off, Mr. Kropstash, how do I say your name? I'm sorry.
Crowpatch.
Crowpatch, thank you. Would you mind elaborating on the impact of the fluid mineral leases and leasing process proposed rule, if finalized, will have on the oil and gas industry and smaller energy producers? So could you just elaborate on that impact?
Sure. At least in Wyoming, it'll force operators off of federal lands and off of the private and state lands that are adjacent due to the nature of horizontal drilling and the location of those lands. It'll also, due to the bonding requirements, force many of the small businesses in Wyoming, the small operators, out of business because they can't afford the increased cost in bonding in the time frame that's allowed.
Yes, thank you, and that's exactly right. I've heard several concerns from operators in my district on the western slope of Colorado that the increases mandated in this proposed rule will impact smaller producers who can't afford to operate in the market. These additional fees, as you know, will ultimately harm returns and reduce revenues to state and local governments by disincentivizing development on our federal lands. Now, the additional fees required by the proposed rule will reduce revenues and state and local governments. This is by disincentivizing development on these federal lands. Can you expand on the negative impacts the proposed rule will have on western states?
Yes, I think similar to Wyoming and the land ownership patterns, it'll force the production off of those lands. It'll reduce revenue and taxes that the states use to fund the local governments. In Wyoming, we use those revenues and taxes to fund public education, infrastructure, emergency services, and things like that.
Yes, very important revenues going to those areas that will be lost for sure. The BLM and the Interior Department have stated increasing these fees will supplement the orphan well program. However, there are only 37 orphan wells, the gas wells on BLM managed lands. Now, do you think that their conclusion is unjustified?
I think the costs associated with that program are a very small percentage of the total revenue generated by the program, the onshore federal minerals program, and due to the processes BLM has to get those wells plugged by other record title owners and the previous operating rights holders. And so there's a very small number of orphan wells as a result of the federal program.
I agree, and the BLM has only utilized bonds to plug wells on federal lands 40 times over the last decade. These significant increases will tie up capital that would otherwise be put back into production. This is clearly another tactic from the Biden administration to de-incentivize domestic energy production. He would rather beg OPEC, Venezuela, and Iran to produce energy for us instead of relying on the American roughneck. Now, Mr. Crowpatch, the opposed fluid mineral leasing rule introduces the idea of using preference criteria to inform the BLM's selection of lands for lease sales. Given the administration's poor track record with respect to issuing lease sales and their lack of timeliness on drilling permit approvals, do you think that this new criteria could be problematic?
I think the new criteria will likely just eliminate further leasing and defer more parcels. The only criteria they'll really be able to use, the only expertise that they would have would be to just lease parcels that are in proximity to current oil and gas production. And what that does is it discourages exploration. And every basin that currently produces oil at one time was an exploratory basin. So if we discourage that, we're going to essentially eliminate any oil and gas production off of those lands.
Thank you. And Mr. Crowpatch, final question. The BLM director, tree spiking, Tracy Stone Manning, said in a statement that the proposed rule, quote, aims to ensure fairness to the taxpayer and balanced responsible development as we continue to transition to a clean energy economy, end quote. Do you think that the proposed fluid mineral leasing rule will do the opposite in many instances and actually prevent responsible domestic energy production?
Yes, I think if we're forcing in, as BLM, by their own admission in the rule, that they would force production off of federal lands, it's likely to be forced into production somewhere else that doesn't do it as cleanly and as efficiently as we do in Wyoming or in the United States.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Kobach, and thank you to the rest of the witnesses here today. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the witnesses for all their